Good evening, everybody. Thanks for showing up, and it's not on. Okay, we're going to start that over. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for showing up to the Dartmouth Libertarians debate on immigration. Tonight's resolution, which is behind me, is America should welcome all immigrants without criminal records. I'm Jack Nicastro, Director of Programming of the Dartmouth Libertarians, and tonight's moderator. I have the pleasure of welcoming to the stage two stalwart defenders of liberty. Taking the affirmative on the resolution is Fiona Harrigan, to my right, Associate Editor at Reason Magazine and prolific reporter on all things immigration. You should really check out her work. I even used it to great effect in a Government 5 paper several years ago. So she's been writing on this topic for a while in a credible enough way so as to not get me points docked by Professor Brooks. Is he? Yeah. Okay, I remember. I'm old. For the negative is Daniel Di Martino, Venezuelan immigrant, Columbia University economics PhD student, and graduate fellow at the Manhattan Institute. So we're going to have an Oxford-style debate with each debater presenting opening remarks for 10 minutes, and then we'll have 20 minutes of cross-examination just between the two presenters, and then we'll allow each of them 5 minutes each for closing remarks. And then we'll open up the floor to about 10, 20 minutes of Q&A from you guys, or me if you guys are not forthcoming with questions. So think of some because you don't want to hear me keep talking. Without further ado, please join me in, we're going to let Fiona kick things off, if that's all right with both of the presenters. So please join me in giving Fiona a round of applause.
And thank you for hosting me here. I've been traveling all over New England and just having a wonderful time away from DC, so it's been a great week for me. And it's an honor to be here to debate Daniel and defend the pro side of our resolution. There are two major topics I'd like to explore today, and those are the cost of restriction, the harm that we see under our current system, and the benefits of openness, or what we stand to gain by drastically liberalizing our immigration system to the extent of this proposition. In an immigration system where all are not welcome, an authority is effectively banning some class of immigrants or some manner of immigration. But banning some method of immigration is like turning anything else illicit, right? We see huge enforcement costs, we see the threat of violence and rights violations on the part of the government, and the potential emergence of a black market. We see these most acutely at the border, and as so many of these conversations do, that's where I'll start tonight. The U.S. spends more on border security now than it has at any other point in its history. Since the Department of Homeland Security was created about 20 years ago, the federal government has spent some $333 billion on immigration enforcement. But even so, we haven't seen a steady decrease in illegal border crossings, despite this increase in budgets. The return on investment is questionable, but that still hasn't stopped the government from really sinking into this mission. It's become increasingly militarized at the border, covered in barbed wire, fences, walls, and surveilled by these massive surveillance towers that impose on both undocumented immigrants and native-born citizens' rights. It's policed by government officials who may detain and deport and abuse people without fear of real accountability thanks to various forms of legal immunity. Border Patrol can legally conduct warrantless stops and searches within a reasonable distance from any external boundary of the U.S., including on private land within 25 miles of the border. Last year, the Project on Government Oversight noted that decades-old federal regulations issued without public comment or debate define that reasonable distance as 100 air miles from any external boundary, including water. As one Customs and Border Protection agent told The Verge in 2022, the normal Fourth Amendment rights for search and seizure do not apply here. This is an area that encompasses 2/3 of all Americans, this border buffer. And border enforcement doesn't stop at the border necessarily, or stop with undocumented immigrants. In 2020, when people were protesting the death of George Floyd, the Department of Homeland Security turned border technology on protesters, U.S. citizens, in over 15 cities. And according to the Georgetown Center on Privacy and Technology, Immigration and Customs Enforcement has access to driver's license data for 3 and 4 American adults. All of this is the cost of restrictionism. As with many forms of prohibition, we've also seen a black market emerge. People unable to access the legal product of immigration turn to the illegal product, which is far more dangerous and facilitated by smugglers. And all of this comes with an unjustifiable body count in the border region. As enforcement and surveillance increase, people inevitably try to cross the border into more remote terrain, which also tends to be riskier. The International Organization for Migration calls the U.S.-Mexico border the world's most dangerous land migration route, and according to the American Immigration Council in U.S. Border Patrol statistics, there's close to 1 death each day along the southwest border, likely an undercount because so many bodies go undiscovered. Practically speaking, restriction requires government force, which necessarily carries the threat of violence. It's unavoidable under our current immigration system and under any immigration system not built on welcome. And all of this costs money, your taxpayer dollars, taken by force without any real opportunity for you to dictate how it's spent. Those who support restricting immigration to the country have much in common with those who support a centrally planned economy. In that economy, a government cannot hope to predict where to allocate resources and when production might be needed in a particular industry or geographic area, and the same is true of immigration restriction. If we believe in free markets generally, we should believe in them here as well. If capital should be free to move to where it will best be utilized, so should human capital. The government doesn't know how many workers a landscaping business needs, when it needs them, or for how long. It doesn't know which family reunification cases are most urgent, and it doesn't know the right number of programmers, refugees, or farm workers to accept each year. And the argument for restriction becomes even less clear when we look inward. Why is movement from a foreign country to the United States so different than movement between the states? We support the right of Americans to move from one state to another essentially without obstruction. People from poor states can move to rich states. Highly skilled Americans can move to places where they'll be in direct labor competition with other highly skilled Americans, and so on. Our first thought, for example, when we hear about the thousands of people moving to Florida isn't whether crime will rise or whether native-born Floridians will have enough jobs. Instead, we often ask, what is Florida doing right to attract all these people? And proponents often hold it up as an example of smart policies. Much of the argument for restriction centers on whether we see the U.S. as a collective or as a project of individuals. And in my view, our founding principles indicate that it's the latter, a project of individuals. You may not be obligated to welcome an immigrant into your own home, but you will be denying someone else's rights by denying him the opportunity to do so. You'll be denying a landlord his rights by denying him the opportunity to rent to an immigrant. And you'll be denying a churchgoer the chance to practice his ministry by denying him the chance to welcome the stranger. The U.S. shouldn't just let in more immigrants, but many more. It should welcome all who do not pose security or public health risks. In other words, the system should not operate on the presumption of ineligibility as it does now, but rather the presumption of eligibility. Allowing free immigration will have a great effect on global GDP since labor and human capital will be more efficiently and effectively allocated and utilized. George Mason University economist Michael Clements has written that, quote, a modest relaxation of barriers to human mobility between countries would bring more global economic prosperity than the total elimination of all remaining policy barriers to goods trade, every tariff, every quota, plus the elimination of every last restriction on the free movement of capital. In the words of another George Mason economist, Brian Kaplan, open borders allow people to move from the parts of the world where their labor pretty much goes to waste, where it's hard for anyone to get anything done. Adopting such a system would allow these people to make a better living and live to higher standards, all enabled by institutions that respect them and their work ethic. The unemployment rate is currently quite low, so welcoming those who wish to come here is a good idea now, but it's also a good idea generally. Even lower skilled immigrants, often the target of restrictionist arguments, fill essential roles that Americans don't want, such as those in agriculture and hospitality. So many sectors of our economy would struggle without them, and so many businesses report difficulty in hiring these workers legally or at all. Objections to an openness-based system are often most applicable to the first generation of newcomers. They touch on worries about assimilation, temporary displacement in the labor market, and the immediate costs of educating immigrant kids. But we see many of these issues resolved in the next generation or two. Research by the Pew Research Center, the Migration Policy Institute, and others show that 90% or more of second-generation Latinos are proficient in English, for one. Other arguments against openness center on security. How will we know who crosses our border? In reality, if you're worried about security challenges at the southern border, it makes far more sense to drastically increase access to legal channels, something that could be done in this far more open system. Funneling people away from illegal pathways, which are currently the easiest option for most, will increase the capacity of border agents to intercept actual threats instead of targeting peaceful families seeking a better life. The level of openness I'm proposing doesn't necessarily mean unmonitored floods of people coming across the border. There's a legitimate role for government to play in knowing who has entered the country and in keeping out those deemed actual risks like terrorists or violent criminals. Designed effectively, it would mean that hopeful migrants would have liberal work and humanitarian pathways to access. Such a system would allow people to move from countries with abusive institutions, little opportunity for upward mobility, and oppressive political systems to become contributors. It's a mutually beneficial way to guarantee better outcomes for a large number of people. And more than that, it's a reflection of our nation's promise, far more capable of welcoming and assimilating newcomers than critics would have us believe, and far more difficult to maintain if not for those newcomers' contributions. There's no solid reason to deny entry, work, or welcome to a migrant who has violated no Americans' rights and committed no crime on our soil or elsewhere, and we must recognize that imposing government restrictions on a peaceful individual's right to movement and self-determination is an unjustifiable violation of autonomy, and one that violates many Americans' right to free association. For these reasons and many others, the country would be better served in adopting a system based on welcome as opposed to one based on exclusion.
I can go, right?
You have the floor.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Well, let me begin by talking about some basic concepts here. Everything is a trade-off. Everything is a trade-off. Even the good things are a trade-off. When you choose to come here, you chose to not do something else. And I hope that that was the right decision for you. Maybe you will find out after the debate. But this is also the case in immigration. And immigrants are not goods. When we talk about free trade and why free trade is beneficial for us, an immigrant is not an apple. It's, there's George Borges says that on immigration that we wanted workers, but we got people. Immigrants are not workers. Immigrants are also people who are part of the society, who commit crimes too, who do other beautiful things. They have families, they get married with Americans, they create new things. And immigration throughout US history has been, and today, a greatly positive thing for the United States. I'm an immigrant, I couldn't say otherwise, or at least think it was good for me. I came from Venezuela in 2016, and I certainly improved my quality of life, and I like to think that I improved the quality of life of other people. But the reality is that not all immigrants will improve the quality of life of Americans. They will certainly improve their own quality of life, and that's a good thing, otherwise they wouldn't come here. Nobody comes to the United States thinking they're going to have a worse life than in their home country. In fact, let me tell you some really important statistic. Gallup, one of the most important polling organizations in the world, does a survey every year called the World Value Survey and the Global Migration Survey. They ask people around the world, if you could move today to any country of your choice, would you move out of your country and where would you go? About 200 million people, approximately, say they would move to the United States. That is in a scenario where they could also move to other countries. Now say we do what the resolution here proposes. The United States lets anybody without a criminal record, and I will also add no public health risk, anything like that, right? That's the overwhelming majority of people. Very few people actually have a criminal record or are public health risks for the United States. So we agree we don't want those. That would mean more than 200 million people would want to move here. Because all the people who want to move to Canada and to the UK and to Spain and to Mexico and other countries would not have those options. They would only have America. And believe me, they will choose it. In fact, they already are. We have about 2 million net illegal immigrants every year right now. And let me tell you what is happening with a lot of illegal immigrants. I live in New York City. They're living in shelters where they're costing taxpayers $300 a night each family. Now you say, that's not the immigrants' fault, that's the politicians' fault, right? That's New York City who chose to give them free housing. Welcome to political reality of the United States, where this is what the resolution says. The resolution is about federal immigration policy. States are not what the federal government controls. And politicians in many places, in their misguided compassion, will destroy our economy in their pursuit of compassion. I met a lady from Venezuela, actually, who was living in a shelter. Sad story, it's not her fault. She's doing what's best for her family. But she said, I came to the US instead of Chile because my brother got here first and they gave him free housing. And then they gave her free housing too. She lives in the Roosevelt Hotel in front of my workplace near Grand Central. That is not a positive addition to the United States. She's improving her life, but that's not the immigration I want. I want immigrants who will come, like they did in the past when the US actually did have near open borders in the 19th century. The government was not giving anybody housing or food stamps. There wasn't even Social Security, there wasn't Medicare, there wasn't Medicaid. The people who failed and went broke went back. And that's tough. Oh, you want people to be homeless. That's how things worked. Not how they work anymore, unfortunately. Because they don't work anymore, we also have to restrict who comes. Let me give you something from the National Academies of Science, which is the latest study on the fiscal and economic impact of immigration, the most important and most comprehensive study about immigrants. One of the things they documented is what's the fiscal impact of immigrants? Meaning, not in 1 year, but since they get to the US until they die or they leave the United States, because a lot of people emigrate, how much did they pay in taxes versus how much did they get from the government? On average, in the US, immigrants actually are net contributors. This is what I'm telling you. Immigration in general is a good thing so far under current policy. But an immigrant who comes here without having finished high school, even if they come here in the middle age, say in their 30s, they're a net $200,000 liability on the US government. That means that, and that's by the way, a huge portion, if not the majority, of all illegal immigrants coming in, and even a huge portion of legal immigrants. What about an immigrant who comes here, regardless of education, at age 65 or older? Well, even the most highly educated, somebody with a graduate degree who comes here at age 65, is expected to be a net $100,000 liability. If you come without high school, $250,000 liability. That is how much of a loss, net loss, we get from immigrants who are old. Now, I'm not against old people coming to the United States. I also want to, I would love my parents to be in the United States. They are not 65, but they will be at some point, and you know what? They're probably going to be a net liability on you guys. And I'm imposing that externality on you. Is that your right? Is that my right? Is that somebody else's right? So clearly, there are externalities here. This is not just about your rights and my rights, and we don't touch each other, and in the world we don't have effects on each other. Because of how Social Security and Medicare exist, all people are net liability. And if we open our borders, believe me, a lot of people would come, and they will qualify for these benefits after working a very, very small number of years. The average American is a net liability of the federal government. Immigrants who come here at old age are even worse. So in enacting the policy of this resolution would mean bankruptcy for the United States federal government. That is not preserving America. That is not the product of the individual versus the collective. That is just bad economic management. And in fact, it is also about the legal immigration system. The legal immigration system is incredibly restrictive on the good immigrants. We don't allow Indians with a Nobel Prize to immigrate to the United States right now because of caps on the number of immigrants from India. That's insane. But we allow the 60, 70-year-old parents of US citizens with no education who will collect welfare benefits after 5 years in the United States and Social Security and Medicare, because that doesn't count as welfare, to come to the United States, no limit. So I'm opposed to the current system. I actually want to liberalize it on net. But we can't welcome everybody who is not a criminal. There will be people who will come. In fact, probably the majority of people who will come under this proposal will be very poor, will not speak English, will be old, and will become net liabilities on this country. I wish that wasn't the case, but that's what would happen. Now let's talk about something else. A lot of the things that were talked about here on immigrants were positive because the current immigrants coming to the States are doing positive things. But that's because immigrants are very self-selected. I'm going to tell you about some of my research on immigration. I don't know if anybody here has heard about the Mariel boat lift of Cubans. In 1980, Fidel Castro, the terrible communist dictator of Cuba, said anybody in Cuba can leave for a period of 6 months. It's illegal to leave Cuba. That's how bad it is. And hundreds of thousands of people came. My research is not about the impact on Americans, but rather what's the difference between the Cubans who came when it was easier to come to the States versus the Cubans who risked their life when it was illegal. Turns out, the Cubans who came during Mario did much worse in the labor market than the Cubans who came right before and right after when it was illegal, because the kind of person who goes through a more difficult process of migration will be a very different kind of person than the person who does it when it's easy. A lot of people are waiting and are not even trying to come to the States because it's difficult. And the problem with this resolution is that the immigrants that would come would be very different from the immigrants who come today. We would have no even ideological thing. Currently, we ban a lot of people because, for example, they were members of totalitarian parties. If you were a member of the Nazi Party, obviously nobody's alive that was a member of the Nazi Party, but if you're a member of the CCP, you are vetted extra, the Chinese Communist Party, you're a member of other totalitarian parties in other governments, that there's a lot of restrictions that we need in order to protect Americans that are not related to crime and public health, mainly their economic cost. And so I love immigrants, and I am an immigrant. I want a better system. I want a system that allows more good, hardworking people to come here, that is incredibly restrictive right now. But this resolution would destroy the United States as we know it.
Fiona, you may begin the cross-examination.
And how do we do that? Are we doing 10 minutes each, or what's?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, great.
Great. Cool. So I agree with a lot of what Daniel says about improving the legal system and allowing more people to come in who are, have these virtuous, highly educated backgrounds. But I think that a lot of the argument for keeping out these less educated, less skilled immigrants, a lot of them rest on assumptions of magnitude and of scale that I frankly don't agree with. We can start with welfare as one point. One of my colleagues at Reason, Eric Bain, wrote recently about this February CBO estimate, which suggested that higher levels of immigration would reduce the federal budget deficit by as much as $1 trillion over the next decade.
Sorry, do we have to ask questions? I thought that's what the examination was.
It's fluid. You
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want us to go back and forth, or do you want us to just talk?
You know what? I'm clearly sitting by
Why
the
don't
seat
we
of my
make it
pants
like,
here.
it's 10 minutes. She asks me questions for 10
Yeah.
minutes, and I ask her questions while her speech for 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Let's do that.
Not just another 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I would love it if we could talk about
Yes.
the number of low-skilled immigrants
Yeah.
coming in, actually. I think that's an important place to start. What do you make of the argument that there are moving costs that would deter migrants that, say, it's not as easy as, well, I can immigrate into the U.S. now, it's much easier for me. There are things like leaving behind your country that you're tied to your family, who don't want to leave,
Yeah.
those sorts of things. What do you make of
Yeah,
moving
well,
costs?
two things. One, the CBO estimate, actually that makes sense because the immigrants who came are in working age. So they're gonna be net contributors until they become old. So we're not really seeing an economic benefit from these immigrants. We're just seeing their initial contribution that is gonna quickly turn into negative. And it's already negative in the States. Like California offers Medicaid to all illegal immigrants. Did you know that? They just expanded it last year. All illegal immigrants get free healthcare in California. In New York State, they do the same. They use state money, it's not federal money, but it's still taxpayer dollars. So yes, they might be a good benefit for the federal government that is not bearing the cost, but taxes are only going up in the states where they're offering this. And then the other, you mentioned travel costs. You're right, travel costs do deter migration, and travel costs are only going down. In fact, that's an argument of why we had very free migration in the 19th century. Because travel costs were so high because everybody was poor. There's this myth that all these Europeans coming to Ellis Island were poor people, destitute, like the Statue of Liberty. If you actually adjust for inflation, the cash that they were bringing thousands of dollars each in their pockets, and they all paid, and they were all among the top in their time because nobody else could afford the boats to come to America. So, I think those arguments are less and less true over time. Yeah.
Do you want to ask a question now?
Oh, sure. Well, you mentioned the GDP boost from liberalizing migration. That's a very common argument in the literature.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know that boost assumes several things, right? Like, for example, that the wages of Americans would fall by insane amounts in order for that GDP boost to happen. Does that, like, do you agree that labor supply is not inelastic and that there are wage effects to migration in large scales?
I think for certain classes of Americans that's very likely, but I also think that, again, it's a question of magnitude and a question of scale. And there's been a variety of research from the Cato Institute and from others who think about immigration in these ways, that bringing in lower skilled immigrants and especially bigger numbers creates more supervisory positions for English speakers, for example. That there are roles that lower skilled immigrants necessarily cannot fill when they come here because they lack, whether it's knowledge of the community, knowledge of the sector, or just the language knowledge that is so basic and so.
How many people do you think would move to the United States if this resolution was implemented?
Well, it's very hard to quantify that, obviously, but I think
certainly over 10 million a year, right?
Yeah.
Over 50 million?
I couldn't tell you. I don't.
But certainly over 10.
Well, look, like we have this Gallup estimate that 158 million adults have this place as their top choice, their top place to immigrate to. We could imagine that would be quickly at first and then gradual to continue.
Do you think there would be, do you seriously think that if 150 million people move to the US within, say, 10 years, with the current population of 333 million, there will be no disastrous effects with that size of a flow?
I think disastrous is an exaggeration, and I think 158 million in 10 years is also an exaggeration because a lot of this is
that's like 15 million a year. That's certainly doable.
Sure, but I think a lot of this is dependent on where people are coming from in a given moment. 2018, there were these huge migration events happening and these huge catastrophic world-shattering conflicts, right? Sending more people into this mindset of I do want to immigrate, and those things vary from year to year. I think people, when they're faced with the reality of moving, not as many people as would indicate they want to move will end up moving. But I also don't think that this is where our argument should center. I think there is a very strong human rights argument to be made, and I do think that it's inconsistent with respect for human rights and civil rights to deny people the opportunity to come here if they are peaceful and want to contribute. Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So, what would you make of the argument that many of these points about being a drain on the welfare system, being a drain to government resources, being harmful fiscally, I guess mostly it's fiscal concerns. What would you make of the argument that applies to many American citizens as is?
I agree, it applies to Americans, but we can't deport Americans.
Sure,
but we can't restrict the entry of Americans, they're born here. And so, people are born with rights, but like, it's the same with criminals. Like, we don't deport criminals because we can't, not because we don't want to, right? I mean, we put them in prison. We do exclude them from society because they did something so bad, we have to exclude people from society, right? Now, with immigrants, the issue is, what happens if the harm you're gonna do to an American is not physical, but you are going to, each of you, be $300,000 taken from the American taxpayer? What happens if we multiply that?
Wait, this isn't exactly a response to whatever question Fiona was going.
It's about the fiscal impact.
Well, I didn't hear the end of her question, so I just want to, can you finish?
She just said, what do you make of it? This is what I mean.
Is your question being answered? Or?
Okay. It's actually answered.
Okay, so, well, the point that I'm trying to make is that the fiscal impact of immigration, of certain immigrants, that I'm telling you, not all of them are. On average, they're not a fiscal drag. I think on average, immigrants are good, the current immigrants. But if we expanded the system to allow all these people that this resolution would allow, then it would be tremendously negative.
Well, tell me also, you mentioned very specifically older immigrants. What share of immigrants do you imagine would be coming over as people who are 65, 70, having these lives that are so rooted in a country, having so many decades of experience in a given place? Why is it that there would be a large number of those people coming over?
Well, already, 1 in 5 immigrants in the United States is over 65 years old. So 1 in 5, I think that's pretty reasonable. In fact, it's going to be more and more over time, because the world is getting older, not just the United States. The world is getting older at a faster rate than we are.
But would it be safe to assume that those are people who are reuniting with family members here and who might have social systems of support?
I agree, but that doesn't make it a good thing. That they're still going to be taking Social Security and Medicare in the hundreds of thousands of dollars from the taxpayer. Now you might say, and I understand, hey, their family relationship outweighs the cost that it imposes on others. But we have to acknowledge they're imposing a cost. And that's going to mean higher taxes for the rest of the population. Now, you might say, well, under my ideal system, the sponsor bears the cost. I agree. I think that if we had a system like that, that would be better. But then you're not having the system. You're actually restricting entry. You're actually restricting entry based on economic means, which I support. And in fact, it's what Australia and Canada and New Zealand do. They require that if you're a citizen of Australia, Canada, or New Zealand, you have a minimum income in order to sponsor your parents. We don't require that. Well, it's the minimum income is like very, very low, and like it doesn't apply. They never persecute anybody for failing, so it's weird.
And I do think that there are many areas we would agree that there needs to be a lot of side policies, in a sense, housing, construction, welfare reform, all of these things. So maybe it makes sense to go in a more philosophical direction. What is so different about?
Do you mind if I ask you a question first?
Sure.
Yeah, and then I like that question. That's good. But you mentioned that the border restrictions and immigration restrictions create a black market and create illegal immigration.
Mm-hmm.
We had a highly restrictive, just as restrictive as today, immigration system in the 1960s. But we had the Bracero program for targeted people, right? With the Bracero program, so that people understand what we're talking about, Mexicans could come here and work legally and then go back to their country. They couldn't stay permanently. They could only stay while they were able to work. So if they're old, they can't stay. They had to have a job offer, so they couldn't come without a job offer, so there's a restriction. But it allowed hundreds of thousands of Mexicans to come work, and there were almost no illegal immigration. So wouldn't you admit that it's possible to have some immigration restrictions and no illegal immigration like we did in the 50s?
These days, no. In our current system, obviously, it's incredibly difficult to come here and obtain the closest analog to these visas. The numbers are way too low for it to make sense. Something like a third of all farm workers in California are undocumented because that's the only way that they can get over and fully embrace the system. I see what I see, and at the southern border, there are these people who they have these great costs to access the legal system, and the risk of death is somehow easier for them to stomach than the risk of going through all of this paperwork and waiting all this time, doing all of these things. So I think even with an expansion of the legal system in that sense,
do you think the Mexican braceros were not poor in the 1950s when Mexico was like a destitute country?
My understanding is that they were relatively wealthy relative to the other workers in Mexico at the time.
I mean, we're talking about wages like, $1 an hour. Like in real terms, like we're talking about really, really poor people back then. And they were able to come because the employers did it. Mm-hmm. But I'm not saying, I agree with you, the current system is not that.
Right.
It's not good, and it needs to be liberalized. But what I'm trying to get the question to be more specific is, if we had a program like Bracero today, not just for Mexicans, but for workers from every part of the world, workers with job offers, not people randomly showing up at the border without any connection to the United States, wouldn't you think that that would drastically ameliorate the border crisis?
I think it would help, but I also think that it gets to this misunderstanding about how many people would come and for what reasons. I think when we see the labor market providing fewer jobs to people, people will take that as a signal, and they'll be less willing to come here and arrive at the border without a job offer, so to speak.
Well, maybe. And then perhaps the other point, we didn't touch on this directly because it's not all about jobs, it's also about public services and housing. Given the restraints on housing, obviously more demand for the fixed supply means a higher price. We agree with that.
Sure.
And I agree that housing supply should not be fixed like it is today. But even without some sort of zoning restriction, there is a physical limit to the growth rate of the housing supply, which means that if we have a huge shock of immigrants, wouldn't that increase the price of housing and make housing even more inaccessible to Americans?
Sure, but again, there are many, many asterisks to this proposition that both of us could agree on, that there are any number of housing policies and welfare policies that would make this proposition easier to stomach for Americans and easier to support fiscally. I think the country's huge, right? There's so many places for people to settle and expand the pie and support new communities and growing communities in ways that we can't anticipate just yet.
And then my final question before you go to the philosophy thing.
Sure.
You mentioned that the second generation fixes all the problems of the first generation of immigrants.
Well, I didn't go
I'm summarizing. I read the book by Leah Bustan, which is Streets of Gold, beautiful book, you should read it. She's an economist in Princeton focused on immigration. Did you know that if you have an immigrant parent who did not complete high school, most of those children will never even go to college or complete a single college class, and just 6% will have a college degree? So, obviously, there is some improvement from their parents. Many of them do complete high school. But the reality is that if you bring in an immigrant who is less educated, their children are also much likely to be less educated than if you bring in an American who is more educated, right?
Sure, that may be true, but education isn't the end-all be-all. The college degree isn't what we should expect all immigrants or even most immigrants to attain, or their kids. And it doesn't mean that they can't be contributors, that they can't contribute to communities and enrich them. And
okay, come on. You know that the average salary of somebody who does not complete high school is multiple times lower than somebody who went to college, right?
Sure, but the farm worker doesn't have a college degree. The restaurant.
What's the average wage for a farm worker on an H-2A visa?
Again, not the best.
It's about $15 an hour.
Okay.
So what I'm trying to say is that's not a bad thing, by the way. I'm not saying that it's not that the farm workers are less or more. Like, I want the farm workers to come while they're working, just not while they collect benefits. But I'm trying to say that obviously there are economic differences. There are some immigrants that contribute and others that drag from the government, right?
Well, we might have some disagreements, again, on the magnitude and the scale of those things. I'll ask you a philosophical question, and keep us posted on the timing if you don't mind. Why is it so different for people to be crossing state lines as opposed to international lines? Where do you draw that distinction around culture and about national sovereignty? How much do those factor in? Because we've talked a lot about the economics and the welfare and these very quantifiable things, but I want to get your perspective.
Yeah, well, we have governments that obviously, you know, we have a country, and the point of the country is that we have a government to protect our rights, right? And the border is simply where the jurisdiction of the country ends, right? The US government doesn't have jurisdiction in Mexico or in Canada to arrest people for crimes that are in US laws. That's all obvious. But the issue here comes in that when a citizen of a foreign nation comes to the United States, they're not eligible for all these, or we are not making them eligible for all these things that are part of the US government. Do you want a society in which people just come over, regardless of who they are? You could say like states, like that would be your ideal, like people would cross the US-Mexico border or like flying, like if they fly in between states?
I want a system that doesn't criminalize peaceful and voluntary interactions and agreements between people. And I think this argument that state lines and international lines are drastically different, it criminalizes any manner of peaceful and voluntary
So
agreements.
what happens if an immigrant comes under this system? Let's do this philosophically hypothetical. They fly into the, I don't know, Miami International Airport. They go to Miami and they become a street beggar. What should we do about that?
There are plenty of Americans who become street beggars.
Oh, so we should allow hundreds of millions of people to come and become street beggars.
Well, again, we get back to it. It's not hundreds of millions.
No, but it would be millions. No.
Sure, but
Let me tell you one thing. An average Venezuelan today would probably be better begging in the street in the United States than in Venezuela. And that's a horrible thing. I'm from Venezuela, I know it. It's horrible. And I just saw a lady in New York City last week that I interviewed her for TV. She's 27, has 2 kids, did the whole thing from Darien. She looked starved. And you'd say, wow, Daniel, are you saying you don't want to help this woman? No, I want to. I hate the Venezuelan regime. I want to overthrow these people. But there are hundreds of millions of people like her in the world who would take the shot and come here and beg on the street. And there are many ways of helping people, but it's like when you're in the airplane and the airplane is falling, the instruction is you have to put the mask first before you put it on your own baby to help them. We can't kill ourselves to help others, and I feel like that's what this policy would do, applying that philosophical principle of freedom of movement uniformly, like you're saying.
But that doesn't necessarily answer my question about how you feel about criminalizing these voluntary interactions between people, whether it's a rental agreement,
I don't want to criminalize anyone. I don't want to put people in jail.
But by supporting restrictionism, there are many, many people whose right to free association would be violated. They wouldn't be allowed to enter into these contracts and these arrangements.
Sure. I mean, the government puts restrictions on the freedom of association all the time. Mm-hmm. You don't support freedom of association like unrestricted either, do you?
I don't know your meaning.
No, I'm saying we all support some sort of restrictions on freedom of association of some way. I mean, we did it with the Civil Rights Act. We've prohibited people from freely associating themselves by excluding people of another race. That's a restriction of freedom of association. And I know this is not what the argument is about, but what I'm saying is that no right is absolute. There are trade-offs. Just like freedom of speech isn't absolute because you can yell and fire, like that's the classic argument, that's why I don't like to use it. So no right is absolute, that's what I'm saying.
But if we take that there should be welfare reforms, there should be reforms to the housing market, these things to ease this transition, ease this process, do you agree that this is not a violation of people's rights to do what they think is right, to associate with the people they want to associate with?
Well, let's start with one thing. The U.S. Constitution doesn't grant.
Let me clarify. It's not imposing the same costs on you if we ameliorate these fiscal concerns.
If what you're saying is, if we reformed all the other laws of the U.S. on housing, on welfare, on work, on many other things, would that allow us, under my ideal system, to have less restriction? Yes. But we would always have some restriction, because I don't believe in a society where there's no government help from the poor. I do believe the government has a role to help the poor. And as long as we believe in a somewhat progressive, some sort of redistribution, then we need to restrict who comes. Milton Friedman said it himself. And I know everybody against, with restriction supports and uses the Milton Friedman quote, you can't have open borders and a welfare state. And so the libertarians say, we'll just abolish the welfare state. Well, no, there are some things that we need to help the poor. And in fact, the argument of Friedman was, we need illegal immigration because they don't qualify for welfare. That's what he actually ended up saying. I think we need a better system that lets in a lot more people than we do today, but not this.
We're going to turn to closing remarks now with Fiona taking the lead.
Sure. So from a small government and individual rights focused perspective on the border and our immigration system writ large, it's my belief that the U.S. should primarily be concerned with protecting individual rights and preventing entry for genuinely risky cases such as terrorists and violent criminals, as I've mentioned. It attempts to do that right now, but it also prevents countless other immigrants from exercising their right to movement, which in turn violates Americans' right to free association and prevents any number of voluntary exchanges from taking place. As I mentioned, employment contracts, housing agreements, marriages. All of this violates the rights of both natives and the foreign-born. Arguments that seek to insulate American labor and culture from newcomers are mistaken for many reasons, and if we believe in people succeeding on their own merits and hard work, then we should embrace open immigration. There are countless people who would immigrate and work their way up the economic ladder if given the opportunity. And that's in part because immigration is an inherently entrepreneurial act. It requires taking on risks without clearly seeing the potential rewards. It requires a vision of a better world, even if that's simply for an individual or that individual's family. And this deeply optimistic view of a new home and of one's potential is something that improves the society we all inhabit and something that we should hope to attract. We're lucky to be the top destination for so many immigrants, and we would be lucky to continue that streak. As I alluded to, there are obviously policy fixes beyond the scope of this debate and this proposition that would enable a smoother adoption process and address some issues of public opinion and fiscal concerns that we may see emerge, including housing construction and adopting welfare reform, to name just a few. But restricting immigration necessarily expands the size and scope of government. It costs more and more of your taxpayer dollars every year. These are unavoidable facts. And we can think about it this way. Would you rather gamble on an immigrant's ability to contribute to your community and your economy, or would you rather gamble on Border Patrol's ability to capture and deport just one more nonviolent migrant seeking work? One of these strikes me as a far better use of taxpayer dollars and far more likely to provide a return on investment. This argument has roots in economics, but it's also one with roots in human rights. A system that bars people from entering voluntary work and housing agreements is simply because they were born on the wrong side of a line and lack proper documentation is not a system that is consistent with the values of civil rights and free association that we hold dear. What we have now is a system that requires armed guards of the state to man an ever-militarized border, is funded by taxpayer dollars, elected by force, without effective enforcement priorities outlined, and it denies immigrants of all skill and educational levels the opportunity to live and work here, not just low skill but high skill too. Policy of welcoming all is far more consistent with respect for human rights and individual liberties than our current system is.
afraid of this resolution, whether in the affirmative or the negative, the only thing we need to choose is think. Let's think what would happen if the US allowed anybody who is not a criminal or with a contagious illness to move to the United States. What would happen with housing? What would happen with hospitals? What would happen with schools? We simply do not have the infrastructure to implement this policy. We do not. Now, we could at some point, and therefore we need restrictions. So we need restrictions, yes or yes, if we don't want to cause chaos. And let's say we do it. Let's say it doesn't matter the chaos. It doesn't matter if 100 million people immediately show up or show up over the next few years. And many of them end up in homeless shelters because Americans are good, compassionate people who will donate their time and money to help them. If just 10 million people show up who do not have a high school education, very possible scenario under this, it would be a net cost over their lifetime of $30 trillion. That is 300,000 times 10 million. I just made the number right here. Very easy, just to add up the zeros, you know. $30 trillion over their lifetime. That's the total size of the US economy. That's all our debt. If just 10 million high school dropouts show up at the border. So yes, it is a problem. No, it doesn't mean we don't want to help others. But everybody has a limit, and we have to get our house in order too. We want more immigration. Imagine instead of having 10 million high school dropouts show up, we have 10 million scientists, innovators, Indian Nobel Prize winners that are currently restricted. I know there's not 10 million Indian Nobel Prize winners, but there's 10 million certainly high-skilled potential immigrants from other parts of the world that would love to come to America and contribute. We should let those people in. That would be good for Americans. At the end, this question matters philosophically too, because we have to think, who does the US government owe something to? To Americans or to citizens that have never lived here? If we think that the US government's job is to protect the rights of Americans, then the solution is clear. We need more high-skilled immigration, but we don't need open borders.
All right, thank you to both of our debaters. That was spirited and edifying. And now we're going to turn to audience Q&A, which we have at least 9 minutes for. Go for it.
Thank you guys for coming. And sorry, what was your name again?
Daniel.
Daniel. All right, I have a question for you, Daniel. It's kind of like a two-parter, but I don't think the first one is that complicated. So you were talking about how at the beginning, people over 65 who, with a graduate degree, are still expected to be net 100K loss, and then those without a high school degree, somewhere in like 250K to 300K for the US. And I'm just wondering if immigrants, because you also said that immigrants currently are like a net positive in terms of like...
On average.
Yeah, on average. So if they're net positive, then doesn't that mean that the people not in these groups grossly outweigh their negative effect with their positive effects? And
yeah.
Would it not continue to be this way?
Yeah, that's a great argument. Well, first, by the way, this estimate is the generous estimate on my part to be good faith here. This doesn't include if we actually had to increase what's called public goods, meaning defense, roads. So this is assuming we don't need to build new roads, which if we welcome 150 million people, we do need to build new roads, obviously. So I'm actually giving you a lowball estimate. But even continuing with that, yeah, obviously that means that the people who are positive outweigh the people who are negative on average. Why would you want negatives in the first place when you can get only the positives? That's my whole argument.
And then, yeah, my second part is, can you give an example of a policy that would kind of filter immigration based on economic...
We already do. It's called the Diversity Visa Lottery, which Reason Foundation has written very positively about. You need to have a high school diploma to apply for the visa lottery. You're required. That's a restriction. In fact, what if we just had, we could have, in fact, the resolution would still fail if you supported open borders for anybody with a college degree or just high school. You are still restricting like half of the world's population. If you say nobody over 65 and without a high school degree can come, but anybody else can. That would be a very, very open border, right? And it would be actually very fiscally positive for the United States. But this resolution goes much farther. It says anybody can come, no matter their qualifications, age, or potential impact.
So you're saying that limiting people who are over 65 and don't have a high school diploma.
That's an example. I mean, that's.
But it's like that would work. So why wouldn't
That would be a huge, much more net positive than this.
Okay.
Like if you ask me what's my preferred system, you know, I think in very realistic terms of gradual modifications, because, you know, we're not going to overturn the whole terrible immigration bureaucracy we have today. So I think in more gradual modifications for practical reasons.
Got it. Thank you.
Go for it.
I also have a question for you, Daniel. So you were, like, a lot of your argument was centered around immigrants that are skilled or educated, and those can be very arbitrary words. And you were saying that immigrants that we should allow immigrants that are doctors or engineers or, you know, Indian Nobel Prize winners. But what would you have to say that when these people do try to immigrate here, those diplomas from their home countries mean nothing in the U.S. and their education means nothing? Like, they would have to restart in the U.S. and maybe go through, you know, getting education here just to get the same degree. What do you have to say to those people?
Yeah, well, that's a bad thing. I mean, I don't want people to restart their education. Well, certainly lawyers do, because the law is different. But doctors certainly shouldn't have, and that's a different restriction. But even people with foreign medical doctors do very well in the United States. Because the reason education is an interesting filter is because, how did you get into Dartmouth? A lot of it is not that Dartmouth improves who you are, but that Dartmouth already pre-selects good people, on average. And so colleges around the world are basically a selection mechanism. And that's one argument. Another argument is, you're right, it's not all about education. I mean, I want people who don't have an education who are coming to invest, or entrepreneurs. We have an EB-5 visa program, which is for millionaires to invest money here. It's limited. Only 9,900 people a year who invest over $1 million and create 10 jobs for Americans can come. Why? I want as many millionaires to come to the United States and create businesses and companies. There's no education requirement for that. We should have an entrepreneur visa. Like, I'm not against. I want a system that actually allows a significantly higher number of people to come than they do today. But also some people who are coming today who I don't think are necessarily a benefit. That's all I'm saying. I think it's a pretty nuanced argument.
But what about students that, like, are first-generation, children of first-generation immigrants? A lot of them obviously go to college, you know, full ride through certain programs like FISAP or Pressbridge. Like, what do you have to say about those? Because I know you were saying that only about 6% of second-generation students make up for.
No, only 6% of the second generation when their parents didn't complete high school. The second generation of immigrants who did complete high school, you want to know how much it is? Sorry, who did complete a bachelor's degree? 47% finished college and 30% have a graduate degree, meaning 77% of them have higher education if their parents went to college. 22% just did some, so maybe an associate's degree or something like that. So that inequality gets even larger over generations. So due to the second generation change, it's an even stronger argument that we need more highly educated immigrants, because their children will also be higher educated. The children of smart people tend to be smart. The children of musicians tend to be musicians. Do you know Julio Iglesias, the singer, Spanish? His son is Enrique Iglesias, also extremely famous singer. I mean, there's a reason. He's his son. You know, so people are similar to their parents in some ways, and that's why you want the best parents to also come to the U.S. and have children here.
Any other questions?
You should ask us about career opportunities at Reason and Manhattan Institute.
Yeah, if there are no more questions, any just like final remarks from our wonderful debaters?
I think we've covered it.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank
Well,
you.
can you join me in giving our presenters a round of applause?